Hey guys, wanted to show you guys some kind of traditional watercolor techniques that you guys can try in your sketchbooks or on a separate piece of watercolor paper if you prefer that. But I'll just go over a few different techniques. I'll show you guys how to do a flat wash, dry overlay, wet on wet, glazing, resist, some splatter, some salt, rubbing alcohol, watercolor pencil, and I have these water-soluble pastels that work really great. And then you guys can just kind of experiment with it in your sketchbook, work with it with India ink, whatever you want to do. I just figure I'd give you guys kind of the basics. You can run with it, okay? So first one, I have taped my, you guys can use your sketchbook paper. What I might do for that is take some painter's tape if you have it at home, or if you're in the classroom, we have some, and just tape off a square. The reason I tape it to this board is because it prevents it from warping as much as it normally would. And your sketchbook paper is thinner, so it will warp more than this watercolor paper will. But all I would do is let it dry and then close up my sketchbook, put a bunch of books on top of it to kind of weigh it down and kind of flatten it back out. It's not going to be perfect in your sketchbook, but really we're just kind of experimenting and playing around with it. So there really is no pressure to get it perfect. All right, so I have some watercolors here. At school, we do have some of these watercolor paints in the tube. These go a really long way because the pigment is very intense. And you just take a little bit and you kind of put it on a palette and you can water it down. You guys at home, I believe, all have a set like this. They're semi-moist watercolor sets. They're pretty basic, but you can do a lot with them. You can use this as a palette on the other side, or you can grab a plate or a palette if you have one at home to use to mix colors. So for watercolors, what I'm going to do is, in order to make sure that I'm maintaining the same color while I'm painting, like if I'm going to do a flat wash, let's say I'm going to do my flat wash in this square here. And then I'm going to do my dry overlay in this square here. So I'm going to paint both at the same time because my dry overlay needs a dry layer of paint in order to do the overlay. So I'll show you guys how to do a flat wash twice. That way you get double the lesson, right? So what I'm going to do is I want to mix, if I'm going to use, even if I'm just using the straight up color out of the palette, I want to make sure that I have enough mix that it's going to cover the whole area that I'm working on. So I want to make sure I can cover this whole square here with the amount of paint that I mix up. So I'm going to make sure I have enough water in there. I feel like that will cover that square. And you guys will have to kind of experiment with this and kind of get a good idea for how much you actually need. This is probably plenty. But I'm going to just go ahead and start mixing some pigment in there. And you can tell too, I'm kind of wiping my brush off on the side. That's so I'm not just transferring my water to my palette here. What I really want to do is pick up the pigment and leave it here, not necessarily bring water over here. But use water to kind of loosen up that semi-moist paint. Bring the pigment back over to your palette. And you can kind of experiment with how intense you want the color to be. So if I took this red right out of palette, and this paper is pretty old. I'm using a piece that already has a painting on the back side, so the paper might react a little bit differently than a fresh piece, but we'll just make it work. So this was straight out of the palette. This is going to be my watered down version, so I'm just going to move this to the side here. Oh, and I spilled it, of course. All right, so hopefully I can do this and you guys can see this pretty well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my brush. I'm going to soak up some of the paint that I mixed into my brush, and I'm going to start at the top. And you can see I'm tilting my board just slightly. And what's going to happen is there must be something in this paper that's resisting it. My paint, where I just painted that watercolor, there's this drip on the bottom that runs along the bottom of my brush stroke. What you want to do is take that, you want to carry that drip all the way down. And that's what kind of keeps that flat wash nice and consistent, so you don't get brush stroke streaky stuff. So I'm just working on pulling that drip down as I go. Now the reason that I wanted to mix enough to cover my whole square is that I don't want to have to go back and mix more water and more pigment, because the likelihood of me getting the exact amount of pigment to water again and matching that color perfectly is pretty unlikely. So I just wanted to make sure that I got it all the way down my square without having to mix more paint. So now you can see I've got that drip along the bottom. If you want it to look really clean, you can give yourself a thirsty brush. So I just wiped my brush off on my apron. You can use paper towel, whatever you have. Dry out your brush really good, and what that's going to do is it's going to make it thirsty. That's what they say. And it'll just suck up all that extra watercolor. So you have a nice, clean, flat wash, okay? So I'll show you again. I'm just going to soak up some paint. I'm going to start at the top, tilt my board. And if you don't have a masonite board at home, you can use like a thick piece of cardboard. If you have one, if you really need a board, let me know and I will get one ready for you to come pick up, or I can drop off if you're working at home. So I'm just going back and forth, dragging that drip down as I go. And what that's going to do is make a nice flat wash. No streaks. It should be a consistent color, or at least close to it. All right, so there is, and again, I'm going to dry off my brush, because you can see there's that little drip there, and I'm just going to use that to kind of soak up that last little drip that I don't necessarily want to show. I'll kind of do that over here too. All right, so there's your flat wash. Consistent, flat color. Pretty simple, right? So I'm going to let my flat wash that I'm going to use for my dry overlay sit and dry completely before I come back to it. I'm going to use the same red for my dry overlay, as well as I'll show you guys some glazing on that one as well. All right, so we'll move on to a wet on wet sample. All right, so wet on wet is, I'm just going to draw these squares so it's easier for you guys to see the different samples. So for wet on wet, what you want to do is go to your water source and make your paper wet before you even add paint. Now, if I had cleaned up my brush better, it wouldn't be pink, but that's okay. I'll make it work. So I'm just going to make sure that the square's got enough water in it, the paper has absorbed the water, so that when I bring some color into it, all right, so I'm going to mix a new color here. Actually, I'm going to use a palette so I keep my colors separate. And just like before, I'm going to put a bunch of water in my palette, and then I'll come back for the pigment, which you guys cannot see. Okay, so I've got my palette. I'll mix some purple in there. Maybe some blue. All right, so I'm going to go back to my square that's got all that water on there. What I'm going to do is I'm going to just drop it on there. And I can paint it, but you can see that it's bleeding. It's spreading on its own because there's so much water on the page already. So that is wet on wet. So I'm applying wet paint to a wet surface. And it kind of does its own thing, kind of spreads out in its own direction. So this is good for like, a lot of times for like skies, or like if you want that kind of tie-dye texture, and kind of play around with that technique. And you can do more than, one color mixing in with another color. Really layer it up. Let's see if I can add some more colors here. Experiment with it. See what you can make out of it. And then just let it dry on its own. Or you can take a hair dryer and kind of direct the way that it dries, which will just like make drips go in a certain direction. Or it's okay to experiment with this and see what you can come up with. Okay, so that's wet on wet. Accidentally got green on my flat wash. All right, so the next one I want to show you guys is, let's see, let's do some resist. So I'm going to draw another square here. So there are a couple of different ways you can do resist. One is to use something like this that we have in the classroom, which is called Frisket. You essentially paint it onto the surface. It's good for masking certain areas. So let's say I drew like, I don't know, a flower, and I wanted to keep the paint. I wanted to just paint over the top of it and not worry about having to go around those edges. I could paint this Frisket right on top of that flower. And then once everything has dried, after I've applied the paint to the surface, the paint has dried, the Frisket's been dry, I can come back in and the Frisket will rub right off. So it's really nice for like really controlled areas that you want to keep clean and not have paint go into. Another option is using tape. You can use masking tape, but painter's tape works really great. So you can make stripes, whatever it is that you want to do. I'm just gonna make something up as I go here. So that's an option. So we've got some tape down. I'm going to paint the Frisket on here. So it's got consistency of like a loose glue. Smells kind of funny. I'm just going to paint it where I do not want my watercolor paint to go. All right, so I've got my Frisket down. I've got some paint down. When you do use the Frisket, make sure you wash the paint brushes out right away. Don't let it dry on there because it dries pretty quickly, and then that brush is really hard to clean. So just make sure you rinse that out. Not like I'm doing right now. Another option is to use some oil pastels. So anything that's oil is going to resist water. So that makes sense, right? You can look for white oil pastels, or you can use color and it'll still have that vibrant color even after you've applied some watercolor over the top of it. It'll maintain that same color because it's just going to resist watercolor completely. And it's good too for like that texture. You can kind of pull out the texture of the paper. So your oil pastel just hits the surface of the paper, and then your watercolor is going to go kind of beneath it. Where you can get kind of multicolors going on here. So I'll show you here. All right, so here's just a couple of experimental stuff going. I don't know. Feel free to just experiment. Have fun with it. I'm not trying to make a masterpiece here. I'm just playing. All right, so I'm going to let the frisket dry. And while I do that, we will do some rubbing alcohol and some salt. So that's for rubbing alcohol, and we'll do the salt example over here. So a lot of you guys probably have salt at home in the kitchen somewhere. So this is one way to get some texture using watercolor. So I'm going to paint my color here. So I'm just going to apply the paint kind of quickly here. So here is my watercolor square, okay? I might actually want to go back and get some more pigment, make it a little bit darker. So the more paint I put into my little palette here, the ratio of paint to pigment really makes a difference. So if you want like a denser color, add more pigment and don't add more water. That makes sense. So I'm just trying to increase the intensity of the color here. I'm probably going to do the same thing for this square over here for the rubbing alcohol. And I'm being pretty sloppy about this, but you guys can be cleaner with it if you want to, or if you don't mind being sloppy like I am, go for it. All right, so for the salt, you want to apply it when it's still wet, because the salt is going to kind of suck up the water. It kind of pulls it toward it. And then once you have put the salt on there, you want to just leave it. Don't touch it until the paint has completely dried. A lot of people use this for like sandy looking texture. But what it's going to do is it's going to pull that paint into where the salt is sitting, and then the paint's going to dry in that spot. And then once it's dry, we just brush off the salt and it leaves that texture behind. So that's using salt with watercolor. Another thing you might have at home is rubbing alcohol. So for this one, again, I'm just going to open up my rubbing alcohol, and I'm going to just grab some, and you can just drop it on there. And what that does is it kind of expels the color. You can get kind of these interesting drip patterns as you go. So this one too, I think, is more effective when you have a little bit more pigment in your paint. I've got kind of a watered down one here. So let's just put a little extra down here so I can show you guys. Okay. I'm going to take another brush. I'm going to take my rubbing alcohol. You can see how it really expels that color. Once it dries, I'll show you guys a little bit more up close. But it just like pushes that color out to the side from where the drop of rubbing alcohol was, kind of creating this puddle texture. So that's rubbing alcohol. Let's see, I've got some water-soluble pastels here. I've got like 3 sets of these in the classroom, so if you're in the classroom, feel free to experiment with them. They work very much the same as watercolor pencils. So I'm just going to make something up here. And then I also have 1 set of watercolor pencils, so if you feel like playing around with those, I've got these here. So you just draw with them like you would with a pencil or a pastel. You can get them wet and then draw with them to get a nice smooth line. So if you're looking for something that looks really smooth, you can do that. Add water as you're drawing with them. I like to come back with a brush. So like for this guy, I put water on my brush, and you can kind of pull some of that pigment from your drawn line. And what I really like about these is that you can still maintain that sharp line that I drew, but then on the other side, kind of create like a dropped shadow by pulling pigment from the line that you drew with the colored pencil. So you just kind of use that as a well, almost like you get your water and you're pulling that pigment from that line that you drew. Okay, and then I'm gonna go for my bigger brush for this one. And this blue is that pastel, that wax pastel, and it gives you really vibrant color and really dense pigment, which is really fun to play around with. So I'm just gonna kind of, you can see how you can kind of pull it out to get more value or lighter values. And again, if I wanted to kind of soak up this extra pigment here, I could make my brush thirsty and kind of pull it back out. But you can see, again, just really vibrant color from those pastels. Those are really fun to play with. And then I'm going to come back and show you guys this is the watercolor pencil. And again, it's like pulling from a well. You can still see my line that I drew, but you can get a nice watercolor wash just by pulling from that line. All right. So now, I think I will go back to glazing and flat overlay. So I have to make sure I wash my brush off really good because I'm going to be mixing colors here if I'm not. All right, so I'm going to go back to, so a flat overlay is when you have one color that is completely dry and you're going to go back and grab the same color that you had mixed, which I still have some of that red, and you paint over the top and you let that dry. And then you come back again after that's dry, adding one layer at a time, allowing it to dry. And what this does is it doesn't bleed like the wet on wet one. Because if the layer underneath was wet, it would bleed like this one did. But because it's dry, I can paint pretty distinct brush strokes and they will remain where they are. They're not going to spread. So I'm going to let that dry. And then glazing is very much the same thing, where you have a flat color that you have painted. But what it is you're taking another color and you're painting over the top. And because it's transparent, you're creating new colors. So, if I took this blue off to the edge, it would be a different color than what was created when it was overlapping that red. So that's why it's called glazing. You're creating new colors by mixing transparent colors one over the other. So we'll let this guy dry. I'm just going to kind of soak up some of the extra pigment. Dry out my brush, make it thirsty. I'll drink it right up. And then once that's dry, I can come back in and do another layer of dry overlay. So while that's drying, I'm going to come over here and we will do the resist. So I'm going to come back in for some more blue. I need to mix up some more. Maybe I'll go with green this time. So again, I kind of want to show you guys what I'm doing here. I should have given myself some more space. So I'm taking from the well of my watercolor palette, kind of mixing my brush with the water and then scraping it off on the side, and then coming back for more pigment because I want to make it a denser color. And then I can kind of experiment on the side over here, see if I like it. And don't be afraid to mix your colors too. So I'm going to actually grab from the yellow a little bit. Now, I know You guys probably did this in elementary school, where you're mixing colors and all of a sudden like your yellow turns green. Again, that thirsty brush, you just got to know your thirsty brush. So I like that kind of yellower green, so I'm going to go with that one. Clean off my brush, dry it off, and I'm just going to kind of come back here and kind of pull all that extra green out of there so I have a nice clean yellow for when I need it again. And you can always add like fresh water to it and then come back with a fresh or with a thirsty brush to kind of soak up any extra green that might have stayed in there. But I think that's good enough for me. So now I'm going to take my new color that I've mixed up and I am going to paint it over the top of my resists. So I've got, again, the frisket. I have my oil pastels and my masking tape or painter's tape. I'm just going to paint right over the top of it, and it's going to resist that paint completely. It won't let it touch the surface of the paper. The oil pastels stay the same color because it does not absorb any of the paint color that I just applied. All right. So I'm just going to try to clean off my brush a little bit here, get some fresh water. All right, so you can see I kind of cheated a little bit and used the hair dryer. But I did add a couple more layers to my dry overlay. So my original dry overlay was this box here. I added a third layer here along with those two rectangles. And then my fourth layer were these circles that I applied again. So it kind of gives you that kind of ghostly layered look. The values build up as you increase the layering of dry overlay. So that's dry overlay. Again, just to reiterate, this is glazing. So we're taking another color, we're applying it over the top of another flat wash or a dry wash. And what you're doing is you're kind of mixing colors. So this is the blue, and when you overlay or put it over the top of another color, a flat wash, then you get this glazing effect, so it changes color. This was the wet on wet, which is still drying, even after blow drying it for a while. So I'm just going to let that one kind of air dry. This was the oil pastel, the water-soluble, actually wax pastel. This is Watercolor Pencil. This was the rubbing alcohol effect. So I just dropped a couple of drops on there and it kind of expelled the color. Same with this one. And then here is the salt example. So I can brush that off. Now that it's all dry, I can rub it away. And you guys can kind of see, maybe. And I'll do some close-up pictures for you too. How the color kind of collected wherever that salt was sitting. So you kind of get like this water texture. But I'll post some close-up pictures of that as well. And then, of course, the flat wash. So then to reveal the resist here, I'm going to take off the tape now that all of that paint is dry. And I won't risk that paint kind of seeping into the white area that I wanted to resist the paint color. So that is the tape. You can see it maintained the color of the paper wherever that tape was. So if you need really stark, bright lines, tape is a really great way to go. And then the frisket, just gotta be careful not to rub my oil pastel too much because that will blend into the paper. So I'm just trying to get the frisket itself. So it will rub off. It's kind of like rubber cement. You can see it kind of like peels up once you get it going. It's just a matter of patience, kind of slowly rubbing it off the page here. So you can see now that I took the frisket off, and it is the same color as the paper that was below it because it resisted any watercolor paint. So if you're looking for very specific areas to maintain the color of the paper or the painting underneath, so like if I put some frisket over the top of this dry overlay and then painted another layer, it would maintain the color of the paper before that other layer was put on. So you've got masking here or resist, whichever you want to call. So yeah, those are just some examples of watercolor techniques you guys can try in your sketchbooks or on a watercolor piece of paper. Always feel free to look for watercolor techniques and videos online too. There's a lot of really good stuff out there, and there might be techniques that I didn't show you today, but I was just trying to get you something quick to kind of work with and kind of get the basics down. So yeah, again, feel free to explore, play with it, see what you can come up with. It doesn't have to be, a beautiful painting at the end. Right now, we're just experimenting with watercolor. Okay? So have fun with it.